Hello, welcome to Generative AI in Action. I'm so excited that you've joined us as part of our community. We're thrilled that we've been cultivating a community of social impact organization professionals using data science and AI in the service of humanity so that you can continue to grow your skills with one another. So we've been researching and experimenting with generative AI for about 18 months, and we had our first webinar in February 23. And this webinar comes after a follow-up webinar in February of 24, and which we shared a year of generative AI learnings. And now we're really just focusing on generative AI in action. So what's happening at social impact organizations, and what is that journey really look like for these organizations over the last year and a half? So before we get into our speakers, as you'll be hearing directly from them the majority of our time today, I'll briefly share that DataKind is a nonprofit that helps mission-driven organizations unlock their data science and AI potential responsibly, with equity and accountability top of mind. So we really focus on teaming talented data and AI experts and building products and solutions to support social impact organizations by collaboratively designing solutions to tough global challenges together. And so we're here today with three fabulous speakers. Tom Tasukshri is the Director of Product at Grounded Solutions Network, where they're focused on improving housing access. Alice Kershaw is the Head of Digital Transformation at the Wildlife Trust, and they've also been on a generative AI journey at their organization she's been leading. And Jacob Lepik is going to talk about specifically diving into what it looks like to implement a generative AI solution on data science work at Vivery. And all three of these speakers participated in DataKind's first cohort of learning circles, which is a peer-to-peer knowledge sharing program with the intention of empowering organizational data science and AI learning and growth. It's really supposed to be a space for professionals at these social impact organizations to engage in peer-to-peer knowledge sharing with a cohort, alongside support for data strategy that enables organizational growth from a trusted expert. And we're all learning right now what great AI usage looks like. So DataKind's been engaging these leaders through these learning circles to help each of the organizations understand and apply best practices in their context. So when thinking about equitable and accountable generative AI, these leaders met for 4 weeks of discussions, reviewed learning materials in between, and then were optionally matched with a generative AI expert volunteer for one-on-one consultations in order to increase their ability to leverage data and AI tools independently in alignment with their mission. And so that brings us to today. This webinar is part of our nonprofit Data 101 program, which is focused on also building AI and data capacity in the social sector by providing 1-hour webinars on various topics, followed by the option to participate in a free 30-minute consultation with DataKind. So we really hope you'll join us for a consultation to continue to engage with the DataKind community as a follow-up. And I'm really excited to connect with any of you who are interested in that. So this brings us to our agenda. All right, so first, our Grounded Solutions Network is going to share about implementing generative AI guidelines, which is one of those first steps as you're starting to evaluate how your organization is using generative AI. And then next, the Wildlife Trust is going to dive into that next step of assessing a use case and really thinking about the risks of different use cases, which will bring us to actually fine-tuning a large language model in order to automate structuring data, which is what Vivery's been working on as far as getting into the technical weeds of a generative AI project. So wherever you are in your journey, whether you're in the policymaking side, assessing risk and picking your use case, or fine-tuning a model, hopefully there'll be something you can relate to today. So with that, I'll pass it off to Tom to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Really excited to be here today. Once again, I'm Tom Tasukshri. I'm the Director of Product with Grounded Solutions Network. Just a little bit about our organization. We're a national nonprofit organization that focuses on affordable housing. We're a membership org, so we really represent a niche affordable housing industry, which is called the shared equity sector. And what we generally try to promote is housing subsidies that last. So most subsidies usually go towards down payment assistance and help one family, but this allows the subsidies to stay with the communities to really help prevent gentrification and really put the home values in the hands of the community. So that's really what we focus on. In my role at Grounded Solutions, I oversee our Salesforce product, Homekeeper. It's a product that over 180 organizations use to track their programs and measure their impact. And I also oversee their internal technology operations. So I provision hardware, I work with them to provision software. So that's where kind of the artificial intelligence comes into play. So I'm going to talk a bit about that from that perspective. As we kind of progress through the presentations, you'll kind of see a lot more on the data science side as well. But really going through what our journey kind of looked like. It really started probably around September. I was at a conference. It was a Salesforce conference, and the big theme was actually AI. And in the middle of it, one of my colleagues just sent me a Teams message and said, "Hey, I really need to I have a lot of meetings, and I can't really keep up with the notes and action items as I'm moving between them. Can I just use this AI thing to help take some notes?" And I was in the conference, I was immersed in everyone saying AI is the best thing in the world, and we should use it for everything. So I said, sure, if you have the budget, why don't you pay for it? When I get back next week, I'll take a look to see what's going on. So we went ahead and did that. When I got back, I started getting some questions from folks around why is this AI note taker entering our meetings and recording us? Why am I getting emails that are showing a analysis of my facial expressions? So then I started to ask questions around privacy, which led me to find a lot of articles that started to increase my anxiety levels around what this means and how quickly these things are moving. So I wanted to take a quick pause back. I started attending some more webinars and learning more. And the more I found was that there were 7,000 of these AI applications out in the arena already. There are 7,000 more that were going to be projected through the end of 2023. And they weren't just note taking, they were everything. It could be used for videos, photos, music, voice. And I just became quickly overwhelmed. I think this is a sentiment that many people have felt with AI. Is just it just kind of hit us like a truck. So I really needed to then take a bigger pause back and really consult an expert. So of course we all have access to a very large language learning model that is an expert. So I went to ChatGPT and I wrote this prompt to say, "Hey, ChatGPT, can you help me draft a policy for a nonprofit organization? I really need some help getting started." As a product person, I always feel that if we're going to be suggesting tools that folks use, that we use them ourselves. So I absolutely tried to do that here. And it's also important that if we want to make sure that policies like human in the loop are part of it, then this is it as well. So I gave it this. It began to draft me a policy. And what happened through it is I accepted some of the things that it wrote for us. Gave us some good ethical considerations, human elements. I added some actual suggestions around tools that we can endorse. One thing we found is that we fully restrict technology for everybody. They're going to work around it. But if we give them what they want and allow them some usage, then they'll work around and work with us. They also offered ChatGPT also offered other things that I didn't consider, like ongoing training. And the funniest thing was when I did specifically ask for talent over subscription services, because I wanted to make sure we prioritize the real voiceover actors over subscription services that can generate it. It actually came back and said, you should also evaluate subscription services. So any anxiety that you might have about the machines taking over might actually come to fruition. So do be careful about it. And that's why it's really important for humans to be in the loop in these decisions. So now that I had this kind of these guidelines in place, when that's an interesting bit about it is we first wanted to call a policy, but because we're a nonprofit, we would have had to get board approval. So instead of waiting, we issued guidelines first until we were ready. And we knew this was going to be continuously improving. So it gave us a chance to at least respond to our staff and then take a further step back to really plan a more systematic approach to this onboarding. So that's when in January we attended the learning circle with DataKind. When Rachel reached out to me, we were talking a bit, and our first reaction was, "Oh, you already have guidelines in place. You might be bored in this learning circle." And well, that might have been true. At the time, I was really interested in learning and seeing how folks were using it, and was happy to see if what I've built so far would be helpful. And what I actually found is that I was probably the minority of folks that were in more of the operational side, and most were on the data science side. And I was the one that people were trying to talk to form guidelines, to really understand what the argument was to unleash their work with AI. So having my perspective around what guardrails I was interested in, what privacy concerns I had as a IT professional was really helpful to help them craft their arguments. So going through that, it was a great experience working with folks. And I was then paired with a DataKind volunteer, where then we kind of started taking things into action. So from there, the first thing we did was really to start calling all of our use cases out. So we had previously done a survey that just asked what people wanted to use it for. And then we began to match kind of the highest things with applications we were endorsing. So that informed us using a proofreading software, note-taking softwares, and then really thinking about the next phase around data assistance. So just being a little bit responsive to what our staff was looking for. And then from there, we kind of put them together in buckets of tiers of what these tools were. So the first tier of what we defined as predefined augmentation. So this is where artificial intelligence was used for a highly specific purpose. The tier two were really the co-pilots that you needed kind of a higher level of skill to be able to understand how it could follow you along and do work with you. And the third tier was really what people were really trying to build and work on top of a lot of the existing machine learning they were already doing. So building larger knowledge repositories and chatbots that were really a bigger tier three that probably required a lot more work. These tiers really helped us really segment too around how we can engage our staff. So that's the next thing we did, is really understanding how do we fit our staff into this. So our first step was really understanding like the novices that are not really interested in artificial intelligence, but maybe a little bit. What is our assessment policy for this? What do we need to get them so that they can start using these tools? So the first was our internal training, so that we can use some of these general tools. We do some configuration with them and then let them use things like the note-taking recording and the such. The next tier of how we assess folks were folks that were ready for prompting. So if they understood how to write prompts in ChatGPT over a while, we know that they could engage with Copilot. If they were not ready yet, then we could bring in kind of some experts to do some of this prompt training along coaching and mentoring, so that they can have someone that's working alongside them, and then also bring them in work groups so they can share skills with each other. And then finally, the biggest one would be the model trainer. So these ones that are experienced prompters that really want to build a bigger system. So this we knew was going to be a project scope that required a lot more technical infrastructure, and just a bigger lift. So that really allowed us to think about projects and segmentation. Um, and then from there, we also wanted to be clear about how folks could ask for more tools. I know we endorse the note taking uh, the um, and the proofreading, but we knew more requests were going to come in. And while my presentation won't really go over these kind of individual use case evaluations, when we have the pleasure of hearing from Alice, her team has actually gone through and applied kind of a version of this where they're really looking at some of the risks involved, and how we can accept or endorse or reject certain applications or uses of such applications as we go. But this is really about communicating out so that folks know what the stream is, what to expect when they're wanting to use a new tool. For tier two, when we're thinking about Copilot, we're really looking at Microsoft's Copilot because we're part of the Microsoft ecosystem already, and this is just slightly different and kind of goes over those tiers I was talking about before. People ask, we train them, we give them licenses, and then we put them in a work group. So that really allows them to continue to grow and continue to build our internal knowledge around this as well. And then finally, where we're at now, we're really thinking now about our machine learning and chatbots around what we can build out as a project through the end of the year. So really our core objectives this year are really developing our talent. So starting with our co-pilot membership so that they can expand what we can actually do. What we find in the product world when requests come in, they think they know what they want until they start using things. And then that perception changes once they get more information. So the more we can kind of train folks up along the spectrum, it will help. We want to develop the infrastructure. And if you want to see infrastructure in action, Alice's presentation will be great, and Jacob's will go over those really big implementations around machine learning and how you can use it for data cleanup. And finally, we'll be planning all these internal rollouts to all of our MVPs this year and next year to really build out these programs. And I'm continuing to work with the DataKind volunteer as a sounding board. They've been really helpful to talk through policies, talk through the latest and greatest with AI, and even just chatting about our families and life is pretty fun too. The time zones are a challenge, but as long as we prepare in the interim and spend time chatting and building relationships, it's been great. So with that, that concludes most of my pres. I know there were some questions that come in. I'm happy to answer this one live, which my ChatGPT was ChatGPT 3, so it didn't come with references, but it just kind of took the words and kind of ran with them and worked through our legal department. And that's one thing also that we found too, is that a lot of these guardrails that we're putting together are guardrails that already exist that just need to be reinforced. Like we care about privacy. So that's why we reacted so adversely to a data loss and things of that nature, confidentiality. So those are things that as we build policies, those are going to be things that we can continue. So with that said, I think my time's up. So I'm going to pass it to Alice so we can hear about the wildlife trusts.
Thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciated. All right, hello. I'm here to talk to you from the perspective of the Wildlife Trusts. We are a UK-based, we cover the UK and the Crown dependencies, group of 47 independent charities that together form the Wildlife Trust Federation. We have three big strategic goals. One is to bring nature back into recovery. One is to make sure people take meaningful action for nature. And one is to make sure that nature is playing a central and valued role in helping to address local and global problems. So we are 47 very independent charities, but together we have a shared strategy. And part of that is digital transformation. So it's undergoing a root and branch digital transformation, horizon scanning, looking at all the things that might benefit what we're trying to do. So all that to say is some of the stuff is things we're already doing. Whilst generative AI is very new to kind of, well, the black box kind of AI, the ChatGPT, the Claude's kind of approach, that's quite new. We've been doing some other aspects of machine learning for a little while. So this is a slide that I really like using because there's no greater model for innovation than something like the Wildlife Trust Federation. We've got people based all over different scales trying to solve the same problems. So it means the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. One of my favorite William Gibson quotes. And that looks like this. So we have a number of different projects running across the Wildlife Trust Federation, looking at various machine learning and AI uses. So as a kind of quick summary on here is that we have things like Bugs Matter down in Kent. We have some acoustic monitoring going on in Somerset. We have the fantastic Space for Nature going on in Surrey, which is surveying habitats from space and identifying where there's opportunities for new habitats, as well as using ground truthing from volunteers, which is a bit like the human in the loop side, to make sure that the identification is correct and feeding that back into the model. And then Warwickshire Wildlife Trust are doing some really interesting things. We've posted the link in the chat around how they're using AI with also looking at things like eDNA, once again, acoustic monitoring, looking at how we can do surveying better, how do we do monitoring better to get the real benefit of these tools. So we have an AI user group which predates the kind of generative AI hype cycle that we're seeing today. But that doesn't mean that we've got it all completely nailed down. And it's fair to say that looking at AI now, we've found some interesting use cases. I'm going to just quickly show you them. But there is some concerns here in kind of how we use it. We have pioneering trusts, and this is an example from Warwickshire. So Ian let me use some of his images, which were used generated by Bing, and these were used in a kind of public-facing campaign around what landscapes were going to look like once they've been rewilded, and a way to try and get some more income for the trust. This is an area where actually we have a real need. It's really hard to present to the general public what you might be getting in kind of, 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years if you invest in a landscape, because these things can be quite hard to kind of understand without a visualization. So it's one way to kind of really get across quite quickly what we might need. Now, I know that Ian spent a lot of time working on the prompt for this. And one of the issues that we found was around the kind of species level. Is this a Warwickshire landscape? It took a long time to get something that actually resembled a landscape that would be familiar to the people of Warwickshire and not be totally made up. So we've got some beautiful images here of kind of a barn owl and a kingfisher, but there is some problems with using generative AI, especially image and content, in order to generate landscapes. And I wanted to show you some, which were, I would say, done for fun by Lancashire Wildlife Trust. It would be important to say this was not done to show what a future rewilded landscape might be. But I want to show you an issue. So the one that's on the left is Wigan Wildlife. So for those of our international colleagues joining us today, Wigan is famous for pies. So you can see there is a willow tit there on a pie. Unfortunately, it seems to think it's more of a quiche. So it's not just species that has a bit of a struggle kind of generating accurately. Yes, as someone has pointed out in the chat, one of the big problems there is one of these birds is not like the other in the other image I've got here. Yes, there is a duck, horse, I don't know what it is on that image, because it's not very good at identifying species and it's not very good at creating species. This has become a problem really recently with the fact that people have been using AI to identify mushrooms. That is the last possible thing you should be doing to as a species to go at. Really don't try and identify mushrooms that you're planning on eating using AI. I highly recommend not trying that, but it's not good at species because of course it isn't. This isn't a use case it was designed for, although it'd be really helpful if we did. It's not going to have the level of detail that's going to make it really useful for us to consider. So this is just one of the use cases. We do not tend to use it a huge amount externally, which is why I've picked these visuals, because these are some of the only things. I mean, the Lancashire ones never went external as any kind of comms, but the Warwickshire ones did. So this is where we've started to see AI actually part of our kind of public facing persona as the wildlife trusts. So to kind of go through it a bit more, to backtrack slightly, is that similarly to Tom, actually, we started looking at it probably around last September time with a workshop with our leaders. So bringing together our chief execs and chairs together to discuss our strategy. One of the things they wanted to talk about was AI. We talked about the ethics and about the responsible approach to AI before we started looking at exactly how we're using it. There was a few little use cases going on, like I said, the machine learning, but we really wanted to discuss what exactly are our kind of is our take on this before we start really using it in anger. So this was the kind of output of the Leaders' Day discussion, which is that it's increasingly vital. We're going to see it. We can't avoid it. It's going to be there. It's going to be rolled into things. And we are also going to want to use it because we're trying to solve some really knotty problems and we'll take everything we can get. But ethical use is critical. We were concerned about how it might be used for misinformation. I think that's going to come to the fore pretty horribly this year. Happy 2024, everyone. We're also concerned about the impact it might have on staff mental health and people's mental health if they felt they were being replaced. But also for us, obviously, the environmental and carbon impact was pretty critical. So the kind of takeaway was that really we value genuine human connection. We thought AI was a supportive tool, not a replacement. None of this is necessarily a surprise, but we thought there was some stuff around data management, and Jacob's going to pick up on exactly the kind of example we were thinking of in his presentation that's coming up next. Bit around efficiency is the stuff around automation. We've got loads of things we're doing multiple times across all the different trusts. Could we make it more efficient? Get a bit of insight from all that data and research that we have. Use it more for inclusion. We can put stuff into plain English. We can translate it into Welsh. We work in Wales, so that could be helpful. And creativity. How do we come up with new ideas we might not have thought of before? There's some stuff here. So there's ideas of what we could use. So alongside that, though, I was working with the DataKind AI Learning Circle, but also working with fantastic volunteer who helped me think through some of our use cases and what are our biggest risks. There are loads of risks, but what are the biggest risks to us as an organization? Well, one is hallucinations. We really rely on being a trusted source of information. It's really important to us that anything we put out is absolutely accurate. That's vital for us. So is it going to undermine our trust? We've got to be right about this stuff. Security, obviously, this is a big one for everyone, but we don't want to have like risk kind of security breaches of data or information that we might not want to make public. Carbon is a big one. We know there's lots out there about the use of carbon. So if we're seen to be using something that has a big carbon impact, then potentially is that going to undermine us? So ultimately, there was a kind of reputational trust issue here that underpinned a few of the other larger issues. So we thought a little bit about right, so how could we use it? So we started to work through a process. So I worked with DataKind and the volunteer to work through how do we actually use this system? So we thought of a use case. So here we've got the images of rewilded landscapes to support funding bids, which is a real use case, and the risks that have been considered for this. So thinking about ethical reputational risks. So are we using a program where the artists have been paid fairly? Do we know if there's copyright issues? Is there an over-reliance on AI as a result by staff? Are they not going to think for themselves about what a landscape should look like? Is there a risk we're taking this away from the communities that we work with, so that instead of them deciding what their landscapes might look like and us working with them on that, we impose something on them that's been created by AI? Is there a risk of specificity hallucination? So some of the early versions of the images that were created had, 14,000 different badgers in it, or 10 birds of prey all together that wouldn't normally flock together, because it's just adding different hallucinations alongside the ones around species already identified. So there's some big mitigations here, which is really, really good prompts is probably one of them, and spending a bit of time working it through, human in the loop, and also agreeing when we use it. So taking the consideration of when are we actually going to use this technology in order to help us. It has to be considered use. So I also worked with my volunteer from DataKind on something around how we assess the risk. So looking at the tools that DataKind gave us, we looked at all of the different kind of tasks that we might see here at the Wildlife Trust. So there's things like writing fundraising proposals, summarizing videos and audio, summarizing meeting notes and research findings, and had a look at what are these things we're most likely to see. What kind of type is it? What's the biggest area of risk? Not all the risks, the biggest areas. Is it an ethical yes or no? Does it have a potential positive impact? And then started to look at what are the challenges and constraints. So this is designed for people who are looking at a use case and starting to think, is this the right use of AI? And if it is, what do I put in place in order for it to work? So there's a possible tool approach listed, which I've just put is not a recommendation because this is shared with the Wildlife Trust Federation. Safety criteria, so what do we need to put in place? And then guardrails and mitigation. So I want to say where we are now, just quickly, before I go to where we're going next. So at the moment, we have an AI statement. We don't have a policy. We have a statement to support staff using it, which it's just 4 bullet points and basically just includes the idea of thinking about using it, making sure you've considered security, and making sure that we also mention when we're using it if we use it publicly. And we also have an internal wiki, which includes lots of guidance on the use of AI for staff. We do regular training and workshops on it with different groups across the organization. So on Monday, I was speaking to the people who deal with our corporate partnerships about how AI might impact on them. We also do give support to evaluating use cases. As you've seen, we've got a table for self-guided, but we can also work it through in workshops. There's an AI user group still exists, and we have a digital transformation group where we go through show and tells of what people are doing and how they're finding it. So our next steps are, we are going to be looking at what our AI roadmap looks like. We have a couple of things in kind of beta testing, so internal assistants trained on some of our documents on our shared intranet, having a little play around with some of the OpenAI kind of playground area to get a bit of an idea of how it works and how we might use it. And we're evaluating whether or not we roll out Copilot using the mechanisms that we've designed. So we're also looking at identifying the carbon impact as well. And if anyone has any help for me on that, please let me know, because this is hard as soon as it's kind of outside of our domain. And also, what levels do we consider it on? Is it the training data? Is it how we use it? Is it, anyway, downstream events? Anyway, love to have some conversations with people about that. I'll just put that plug out there. Anyway, but going from that, I'm going to pass to Jacob, who's going to be talking a little bit about a very practical use of AI in terms of data, which we were really interested to see, and definitely one we'd be interested in implementing in future. So I'm going to hand over to Vivri and Jacob.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob. I'm a data scientist at Fiverr. We're an organization that works in the food access space. So what we do is provide find food maps and other software products to food banks across the US. We currently work with about 30 plus food banks, I believe, and contain about 5,000 emergency food resource locations across the US. So for example, if you need food, if you are running out of SNAP benefits, if you have an emergency, then you can go to one of our maps on our partner food banks. You can type in where you are, and you can find locations to actually find some food emergency resources that you can access. This requires working with a very large number of food banks. Each one of those food banks is going to have different databases, ways they store data, sort of consistency efforts to actually standardize and manage that data. And that results in quite a lot of different site types of data that we actually need to sort through in order to put into our own database, right? So we're using different systems. They might be using different data models that organizes data differently. They'll be using inconsistent formats. For example, how they store phone numbers, how they store hours, how they store their contact information. They're all going to have sort of different ways that they want to store and access that information. And then they're also going to have, sort of local terminology. Each program might be named something slightly different from food bank to food bank. And we want to make sure that when a user goes to one of our maps to find a food resource, that they can find consistent access to the similar types of programs to make sure that they can actually do that from wherever, not just from one food bank. Working with this messy data takes quite a lot of time, and it takes quite a lot of human review. Of course, there are some automated ways to do this, right? When we see patterns in data, we can usually construct some sort of rule set to parse data from text, for example. Unfortunately, when we're working from food bank to food bank, and even within food banks themselves, those patterns need to be more flexible than usual. In a lot of cases, patterns that we write for one food bank won't be applicable to the next. And so this sort of encouraged us to look for a way to encode more flexible rules in terms of how we actually parse out data. And this is a perfectly good use case potentially for a large language model. So two ways that we sort of started doing about this. We've been working on this for about a couple months. Our first initial use case was the one on the bottom here with hours. So hours are going to be stored typically very often as a string, right? So if you are looking at when a food pantry is open near you, a database might have that as a T and TH 9 to 12, which represents Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 12. There are many different ways you could talk about this, right? You could use, just the first part of the word. You could spell out the full day name. You can, add AM or PM. You can use 24-hour. Sort of clock encoding. And so we want to make sure that we can actually parse that data into a formatted structure that we use to upload into our database. Additionally, some of these hours might have notes, right? They might only be open to seniors, for example. And so the question becomes, well, how do we parse that and set it into a formatted version? So we can take the T and TH and we can transform it into Tuesday and Thursday. And granted, while T and TUES maybe aren't the exact same thing, right? They do sort of have a general representation that you as a person are going to immediately recognize and say, oh, well, that's a Tuesday, right? And so LLMs allow us to take that general knowledge base and sort of recognize that they're the same thing, that they indeed should represent a Tuesday. On the top here, we also need to be able to extract, contacts. We want to make sure that contacts are consistent across, across a database, right? So imagine you have a database field with 2 contacts and 2 phone numbers. You want to pick out a name and a phone number that are going to sort of map to the same person. For example, an email to as well. If your name is Jacob Lepic and you have an email that says jacob@pantry.com and tom@pantry.com, we'd like to take the jacob@pantry.com because that's associated with the primary contact. And so we want to figure out ways to pull this information. We've been using an LLM for this. This is trained on Microsoft Azure. It's leveraging OpenAI model that was fine-tuned based on a data set of us manually going through all of these files and pulling this information and coding it ourselves, right? So we had that clean, the sort of data mapping from very messy data to clean data of how we want it that was manually reviewed by humans and put together in a very large Excel file. This was then one of our interns transformed that into JSON and used it as training data to train the model within Microsoft Azure. From here, with that model trained, as needed, we'll deploy it to the cloud. And then we can use a Python API to essentially call that model and submit a text string. So this is that first step, is that when we get a new file that we want to clean hours for, we're going to format it as a single text string. We'll add an ID to make sure that we can map it back to our original file. And then we will send it in, and it'll give us a response of cleaned data. Hopefully. Some of those initial cases, we will just simply decline to send if we think they're too complex. That's usually done on sort of a hard-coded character limit. But for the most cases, right, if we do think that the LLM can have a good try at it, we'll send it in. This sort of puts a question of, what are the data cleaning steps that we can make sure to improve quality when we're sending it in, right? Some of that might be removing extraneous information. Some of that, if there are two programs, right, with two different hours that'll correspond to two different entities, we might want to pull those out. So we're only sending in one set of hours at a time. The more consistent that we can make the input, the better output that we usually get back. Again, we already send it through an API. We've written one that essentially we provide an API key, we provide all of the messages, and that's going to send it back and join us to the original file. Note that that output is tested for formatting. So we have, I don't know, maybe 15 tests that are going to check to make sure that any output coming from the AI fits into our format of what we need, right? So it's going to have commas in the right places, and that times are going to be in a 24-hour format, and there's not going to be extra zeros, for example. From there, after we get back that information, we're going to have a person actually review the input against what the LLM provided as an output. This can take a lot of time, right? So if you're thinking, oh, well, we'll just train one of these and it'll save us so much time, still having a human in the loop sort of doing review is going to take a significant amount of time just to be able to check. This is because, sometimes the LLM can, very subtly provide incorrect errors. And so it does take a fair amount of detail to review each key. Of course, as we review these, we add them to additional file for future training, right? So as we create more data and we validate that, then we can add it and retrain the model at a future date. Of course, our automated tests are only checking formatting, so we need a human to check whether the meaning matches. Sure, 1230 to 230 might be valid output, but it's going to be not always true that the input hours are 1230 to 230. They might just be 12 to 2. And then, of course, if we do flag any output, we're going to send it to our food bank partner to review. So when we move from there, let's talk about a couple trade-offs here. Because obviously, the initial review, we can save quite a lot of time, hours of actually going through what the food bank is providing and checking to make sure that it's actually accurate. And so this can save us, maybe a day, depending on how many programs are actually in the file. This also gives us sort of another layer of validation, right? So we're having a machine go through, check the outputs and transform it. What we can also do is after that output comes, we can even send it back into a secondary LLM to sort of say, well, does the input match the output? And that can say yes or no, providing some cue to the human reviewer. Of course, this also gives us sort of a flexible rule set that we can, allow to use across data formats, right, and food banks. So even though the rules aren't exactly the same, even though food banks aren't storing data exactly correctly all across each food bank, we can just leverage the LLM's built-in knowledge to still keep those rules and take whatever generalized format we can use. A couple of risks here, of course, is, just misinterpretation and output. In general, we found they don't like to say, I don't know. So oftentimes when it can't come up with an answer, it's still going to give you something that will have the correct formatting, but it won't be actually correct in terms of the output. And so we sort of have to review that and make sure that it's correct. Some of these fixes, reviewing it can be really difficult. So it does take quite a lot of work to actually just check to make sure that it's correct. There's, of course, monetary costs in training and deploying the model. As a nonprofit, there might be some deals. You might be able to use homegrown models or models that you can run locally too as well. But that's going to take some initial or additional just investment in terms of your staff, right? In terms of your knowledge. Then lastly, just deployment issues, making sure there's availability across Azure. We're introducing an additional dependency, and we have to make sure that this time investment to build pays off, right? So that can always be difficult. So I think that is it for me. And I think we can move on to a Q&A.
Awesome. Well, please put your questions in the chat. I know I learned so much from all three of these speakers, and I'm thrilled to hear what questions you have. I have a lot of questions, so if you all don't share some, I'll ask them. But while you're typing your questions, pop into the Q&A feature, type your question, and then we'll answer it. I'll just quickly share some themes that we noticed across these organizations and the others in the learning circles that didn't present today. One key takeaway that a lot of folks have in the social impact space is really just around defining your generative AI problem statement on a matrix between impact and risk. So we think of this very simply as the x-axis being risk evaluation and the y-axis being potential for impact, and to think about where any possible generative AI use case might fall. And you're looking for use cases that, of course, fall into this quadrant where you have high impact and low risk. And all of the presenters today shared examples of that, like Jacob's presentation looking at the data cleaning with the human in the loop, high impact, saving a lot of time, relatively low risk compared to potential other use cases that are more front-facing. And Alice shared a lot of examples as well of different options and trade-offs in that space. And the last thing I'll share while you all are typing your questions in the Q&A so that we can get them to the speakers is a common question we get is, how can your organization get started with using generative AI to make a positive social impact? So we've kind of come to a 4-step process that is best for really diving in. And first, we think about baseline learning, which is assessing the status quo. Tom mentioned this earlier when he was talking about just having someone ask about using this tool to record meeting notes, and think about what's already in place, do some type of assessment to look at what's going on, the current knowledge and usage, as well as potential use cases and any tools and technologies that are of interest, as well as any blockers currently in place. And from this assessment, you can identify those existing risks and need for learning materials, as well as trainings, and different organizations that might require different levels of training, different groups within your organization, organizations within your organization, whether it's a prompting workshop, an LLM hosting or fine-tuning resource, or just intro to AI. So that brings us to defining our guidelines based on that assessment of potential ethical and legal risks. So with this step, you want to formulate your value-aligned policy, like Tom discussed, build that foundation for standard operating procedures, and make sure that you've identified those clear guardrails for your organization in alignment with your values, just like we heard the Wildlife Trust do, thanks to Alice. And with this gives you the chance to establish dedicated artifacts for exchange on generative AI, whether it's a use case discussion session, an Ask Me Anything, some Slack channel, internal newsletter, really getting you in the practice of communicating around your Gen AI space. Then finally, what Alice went deep into is step 3, evaluating those opportunities to identify and prioritize those relevant use cases and define that vision to find focus. Really important design thinking principles are relevant here. And that's where generative AI can create a lot of value. We've got some resources to help with that. And you also want to really consider those constraints and guardrails, assessing the opportunity and defining the scope with sustainability in mind. All of this comes into narrowing our use case that would be best to get started. And finally, step 4 is setting up that tool and technology stack to get proper access to everyone. And Jacob went into an example of what that could look like when you're actually building into a use case and using the technology. You can use tools developed by others that are already integrated into your system. Try a basic chat endpoint and code and different prompts, and just really focus on intuitive grasps of generative Q&A capabilities before diving into full-on proofs of concepts and developing and integrating your own tools. And this process is going to actually be defined in greater details as part of a playbook that DataKind is developing right now for generative AI in the social sector. We've worked with many organizations that are continuing to get feedback from different folks on the resources we're building. If you'd like to be one of our early reviewers, Taiba's put a link in the chat that you can click on and submit your name and information into that form, and we'll make sure to get the resource to you before it's publicly available, so we can get your feedback and make sure it's most valuable. So with that, I've seen more questions come in, which was the exact goal of this time period. So I'll dive into connecting those with our speakers. Jacob, we've got some questions for you. To start, do you consider automating more than your data management processes?
Yeah, for sure. We've talked about deploying chatbots for our software. We've talked about how we can, sort of replace some help articles with interactive support. Again, like Tom and Alice have talked about, that comes at a much higher training costs and checking and just safety concerns. So we really haven't spent much time doing that. For the most part, the rest of the data upload and cleaning process is already fairly automated, so we haven't found the need for it. But there definitely are cases, right? For example, you could imagine that if a person wants to put hours directly in a software, rather than clicking through buttons to select like hour open, hour close, date, etc., you could just type in a text string. And have that transform, right? So this would be a way of leveraging our current data cleaning, knowledge about how to do this, and then deploying it actually in a user-facing situation. But for now, we're just focused really on low-hanging, specific, and low-risk opportunities.
Makes a lot of sense. And just to back up even further, Jacob, how did you decide that an LLM was the solution that you wanted to pursue? And the follow-up question is, how will your new understanding of its shortcoming affect your strategy moving forward, which you may have already talked about a little bit, but.
Yeah. So I think the key decision there was, testing it, just sort of having the opportunity, having a nonprofit subscription, being able to try it out. We were able to test some early models. We had some experience working with machine learning before, so we knew that this was possible and a totally appropriate use case. Also, just seeing the failures in regular expressions and adapting those, and how much time it took to rewrite those, that they weren't really reusable over time. So that with just limited capacity at our organization, it's me and maybe a couple interns at any given time. We really are looking for ways to save time. Moving forward, I don't think it's going to change our strategy entirely. We have discussed, potentially leveraging them in other places in the data cleaning model. But again, with the issues with hallucination, with tracking, as much as possible, I think a function that has a predictable output is always going to be sort of a better opportunity for us that we can sort of trust. And so that's what we will continue to use. But it has, made it clear that we can potentially use this in other places.
Amazing, so exciting. I'll ask this one's for anyone, but Alice, feel free to take us off. Have you thought about how are you understanding your carbon footprint in your use of AI at the Wildlife Trust?
So it's fair to say the answer is probably quite short, which is because we've only got them at the moment currently in very much kind of prototype stage, we haven't got a lot. So we can tell on the kind of our electricity use, we can tell where it starts to hit in terms of the kind of Microsoft elements of what we've got, because that's visible on some of the dashboards. I am having a real problem with it, because effectively there is some code you can get if you're using Python as part of it, to embed, and so that will then give you some idea of the carbon usage. We're not, so that's so far about as far as I've kind of found, is that we know there's a lot of information out there, and the OECD did a great report on the compute power of AI, and so we're kind of just trying to balance that out amongst everything else. It ties into a little bit of our overall use case of, we know it's going to have a higher carbon footprint than potentially other technologies that we're using. So it's just balancing that off at the moment. But to be honest, I would love a solid answer of exactly how much has been used to firstly train the different models in the first place, and secondly, to use them, because there's a lot of data out there about it, but a lot of it is very opaque and not very transparent. So I think if we move to the model of having our own internal models, that will be a lot easier for us to do it. And that's probably a more desirable state for a number of different reasons. But at the moment, using, say, ChatGPT or whatever, we know it's just effectively, you just have to think it's probably higher than using something else, which is not a helpful answer. So if anyone has a better one, I'd love it. Thank you.
Tom or Jacob, do either of you want to jump in with any thoughts on this one? It's something we've been exploring at DataKind as well, and we've had value in comparing our understanding of the carbon footprint of the models that we're using to things like getting on an airplane or driving a car, commuting. And that kind of helps, charging your phone for a certain amount of time, kind of helps us think about making sure that we're minimizing our use and only using it when it's crucial and when the benefits will outweigh the cons. But at the end of the day, of course, the pre-work of training is huge. And that's a huge component that like you said, you can't quite fully measure right now. But those little incremental, as long as we're thinking about, we have some ways where we're minimizing the amount of memory and searching that it does, where, for example, it's just pulling from an existing database of answers rather than pulling from the entire internet. Things like that to really minimize the use can be helpful, and then it becomes quite minuscule, as a matter of fact. But such an important one. If anyone here has a good answer to that, please put it in the chat as well. Let's talk a little bit about maintaining privacy and data security, especially for sensitive strategic information. Tom, do you want to kick us off on this question?
Sure, sure. I think Alice kind of alluded to it when she said like using public models is probably riskier and investing in models that we own is better and more secure. And I think that's just the general theme. And that's part of how we formed our policy, was really saying, please don't use anything free. Please use these. And that was also important to say, please use these, so that it created an environment where we had control. Especially, and as you get into kind of more of those business level and enterprise level tools, they also offer ways where your data is not training their models. Your data is kind of in its own data center, so they kind of respect that privacy as well. But that's not true of every single application out there. So it's important to make sure you have that as part of your evaluation. But short answer is try to keep everything contained. Not as many free tools. You can use free tools for general things like draft me a general policy, and then I'll work through that. But highly restricting any usage of our proprietary information to feed models.
Absolutely. Alice or Jacob, do you have anything to add on that one?
I would say just exactly that approach, and giving clear guidance to staff of do not put this information into open models is also something that's in the guidance that we submit. But otherwise, yeah, totally agree with that.
Awesome. There's a question for Alice about the conversations y'all might have had around creating images using AI rather than artists for future rendering of bewildered spaces. Could you use AI to generate criteria for what spaces would most likely be thriving in a specific location in 10, 20, 50 years, and then give that to the artists? The author wants to note that they 100% only mean this to be a general question about process regarding how you decide what output you want with AI.
Yeah, so it's probably fair to say we do both of these things. So we do work with artists, and if you look for I'll see if I can find the link and post it in the chat, but Radnorshire Wildlife Trust have recently done a project where they've looked at the future of Radnorshire landscapes over the kind of next 5, 10, 20, 50 years, I think, and they've worked with the local artists to do that. So there is definitely options, but that can take a really long time, because effectively if you mess up your prompt to an artist, it might be a month before you get that back and you know whether they've done it correctly. Whereas if you mess up your prompt with the kind of digital version, it's pretty quick. Now, not necessarily one is better than the other, but that is the consideration of it, the kind of time that it will take to create those images. But we do that. I mean, a lot of the kind of approach is trying to make stuff kind of visually interesting for people. I think I would be a little bit concerned about the AI fully generating. It's worth saying there was a lot of work behind those images that I've shared. They were not a quick and dirty response. They were really considered in terms of the species, the landscape, the descriptions, and the kind of multiple creation of these in order to get to that point. But it probably just depends a little bit on our audience of who's more likely to want images in different ways. I'll see if I can find the Radnorshire one and post it into the chat anyway, so you can have a look at that too. But yeah, we could use it to generate the criteria, and I think that's probably going to be some of the use case, but the hallucinations and its inability to generate decent species representations is probably going to be a bit of a problem for us using it beyond comms, I would say.
Awesome. Absolutely. Really good to hear about. An interesting question. One person shared that it seems like many people at these 3 organizations were ready to move full steam ahead with AI and actually needed to be slowed down and have guardrails put on them. But that's not everyone's experience. This attendee has the opposite issue, in which some people at their organization are very risk averse and clinging to the way we've always done things. Is there any advice on managing this dynamic? I believe that Tom and Alice at least have both run into this. Tom, do you have any thoughts to kick us off?
Yeah, no, I appreciate this question because while there are some cream of the crop that want all these things, there are definitely people that are like, oh, I don't even want any AI anywhere. What is this doing? And even some of our leadership have been like, I haven't even had a chance to learn what AI is. We have to be able to adapt our response to those that are moving fast and those that are moving very slow. And I think it's also generally kind of a technology approach. Going back to like these are things that we're doing already. It's just moving way faster with an incredible amount of volume. So people have always been adverse to automation because they're worried like, oh, is this going to replace me or replace my job if I subscribe to this? What will I do if I spend 4 hours a day doing this and a machine is going to do this in 4 minutes? Those are some things that we have to generally be concerned about, but it's stuff that we've been working through when we're working in this technology assisted world of managing that change for them, helping them see the possibilities, and then help them see that like you don't have to do this boring work. Let's let the machine do the boring work and have you focus on the things that really bring you joy in your job every day. So making sure that the work groups kind of highlight those stories so that people hear from their colleagues is the primary strategy that we use.
Awesome. And I will note, if you have more specific information into the project that Jacob's been doing, he's been answering a lot of the specific technical questions in the Q&A box. So please just click on Q&A and look at the answered column and you'll see some of the questions that Jacob's been answering. So you can learn a little more by reading that while we continue. We do have to wrap up. Do any of our panelists have a final closing remark that they'd like to make? Maybe big lesson learned takeaway that you want to make sure all of the attendees capture. Alice, we'll start with you.
I was just writing in the chat at the same time, which was someone was mentioning the importance of ground truthing and the human in the loop. And I would just say that is absolutely critical. That's the point of this stuff. Like, make sure you have human in the loop, make sure you're ground truthing it. There was a mention there of iNaturalist. Yes, if you're going to identify a mushroom, use something like iNaturalist, iRecord, or Seek. And it also feeds into the NBN Atlas, and we can use that data. So please use that. Still don't maybe eat a mushroom if you're not sure. That's probably the most important takeaway message I can leave you with. So yeah, thanks.
Tom, what about you?
Yeah, I would second that around human in the loop. I guess to add to that is just this technology is always here and and people are afraid of what it can do. People are skeptical about what it can't do. But at the end of the day, it's here and there's a spectrum. So it's really important just to understand like what works for us, what works for what we're doing right now, what are some steps we can take in because if we don't begin to engage now, it's going to keep running quickly. So we have to find a way to attach ourselves to it in the way that works best for us.
Yeah. Jacob, what are your thoughts?
I think if I heard the question correctly, I think using these are not going to solve immediately all of the problems that you'd like them to. It's going to take quite a lot of work and review and testing to do that. So it is a significant investment. And I would recommend that you find the simplest possible problem if you want to do something yourself versus deploying an already existing solution, and start with that most basic thing, and then build off from that rather than trying to go for something complex and flashy. It is a learning process.
Absolutely. Agreed with all of that. I have 1 minute for several closing slides. So please complete the poll. Many of you are already doing that. It should have popped up on your screen. We've got several resources. The links will be shared in the chat. I won't talk through them, but lots of reading if you're just getting started. Please use the link in the chat to sign up for office hours. You'll also get it in your email tomorrow. I would love to connect with you for 30 minutes, discuss your challenges and opportunities. If you want to watch more of the webinars, we mentioned some previous ones. They're all available on our YouTube playlist, which you can directly subscribe to. You can also complete the survey. The link is in the chat to inform future DataKind offerings for the webinars, what topics we want to do. If you'd like help with designing AI for your organization, we do have an advisory program that allows you to design with some of our volunteers, and you can contact Melinda. Her email is here and in the chat if you're interested in that. And finally, if you want to participate in a DataKind learning circle, just like these three folks did, please express interest. Link is also in the chat. This is a peer-to-peer knowledge sharing cohort to empower organizational AI and data maturity growth. You get to engage in weekly discussions, receive curated knowledge materials, be matched with an expert, and ultimately contribute to that co-creation of public resources and grow your ability to leverage data and AI tools. We have a one-day in-person learning circle on May 30th happening in DC that you can also express interest in if you're based in the DC area. And thanks so much for taking the time today. You can connect directly with us at community@datakind.org. And I look forward to more than just this 1 hour webinar, getting to know all of you in future engagements. And so subscribe to our newsletter to stay in touch. Thanks again.